Formula One just launched the most expensive regulation change in its history, and within weeks, everything started going wrong. We are talking about cars suddenly losing half their power on a straight, drivers calling them unpredictable, and audiences dropping at a rate the sport has not seen in years, in some cases nearly cut in half after just a few races. But here is the part nobody is saying clearly. This is not just a bad start. This could be a design problem at the core of the sport. Because the very system meant to save Formula One's future might be the thing putting it at risk. And what is happening behind closed doors right now could decide whether this era survives or fails completely. Stay with me, because the real issue is deeper than anyone expected. Subscribe now, because this changes everything. At first, it does not look like a disaster. That is what makes it so easy to miss. The race starts. Cars are fast. The gaps look normal. Everything feels familiar. But then you begin to notice the small things. Drivers are not attacking the same way. They are not braking at the last possible moment. They are not going all in, lap after lap. Instead, they are thinking ahead, lifting earlier, positioning the car differently, preparing for something that has nothing to do with racing lines. Energy. And this is where the shift begins. Because Formula One has always been about instinct, reaction, commitment. You see a gap, you go for it. You feel the grip, you push harder. But now, there is hesitation. And hesitation changes everything. Because when a driver hesitates at high speed, it is not just a different style. It is a different sport. But here is the detail most people miss. This hesitation is not a choice. It is forced. Built into the system itself. Because every driver now has to think about something that did not exist before in this way. How much battery is left? How quickly it is draining? When it will suddenly drop? And what happens when it does? Because when that moment comes, the car does not warn you. It does not gradually fade. It just loses power. Instantly. Half of it. And imagine being behind a car when that happens. You are at full speed. Full commitment. And the car in front suddenly slows. Not because of a mistake. Not because of a failure. But because the system told it to. That is not racing. That is unpredictability. And unpredictability at this level is dangerous. But this is where things become even more serious. Because drivers are starting to understand it. And once drivers understand a risk, they change how they drive. Not to go faster, but to survive. They leave margins. They avoid certain moves. They think twice before committing. And every time they do that, the spectacle changes. Quietly, without anyone announcing it. But you can feel it. And this leads to a bigger question. If drivers are no longer pushing to the absolute limit, are we still watching Formula One at its true level? Or are we watching something controlled? Something restricted? Something filtered? But this is only one side of the problem. Because while drivers are adapting on track, engineers are fighting something behind the scenes. A system that behaves differently depending on tiny variables. Temperature, track layout, energy cycles, software mapping. Everything affects everything. And that creates a level of complexity that is incredibly difficult to control. But here is where it gets interesting. Because complexity in Formula One is not new. What is new is how visible the consequences are. Because now, when something is slightly off, you do not lose a tenth of a second. You lose performance completely. For a moment. At the worst possible time. And that moment is enough to change a race. Or cause something much worse. But we are not at the most important part yet. Because all of this, the hesitation, the unpredictability, the complexity, it leads to something much bigger. Something that goes beyond drivers and engineers. Something that affects the entire sport. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Because what is happening next is where the real questions begin. Because once you step back, you start to see a pattern. Not just on track. Across the entire sport. And it is subtle at first. Almost invisible. But it grows with every race. Fans are no longer reacting the same way. The excitement feels lower. The conversations feel different. Less about moments. More about confusion. Why did that car slow down? Why did that driver not attack? Why does this race feel flat? And when fans start asking those questions, it means something deeper is shifting. Because Formula One has never required explanation to be exciting. You could show it to someone for the first time, and they would understand. Fast cars, close battles, clear winners. Simple. But now, it is not simple anymore. Now you need context. You need to understand energy deployment, battery phases, recovery limits. And once entertainment needs explanation, it loses immediacy. It loses impact. And that is exactly what is happening. But here is where things become impossible to ignore. The numbers. Because emotion can be debated. Opinions can differ. But numbers, they do not lie. Audience figures are dropping. Not slightly. Not gradually. Sharply. Race after race. In multiple markets. And in some cases, nearly half the viewers are gone after just a few events. That is not a coincidence. That is a reaction. A direct response to what people are seeing. Or more importantly, what they are not feeling anymore. But here is the part that changes everything. This is happening at a time when Formula One should be stronger than ever. Global growth. New audiences. Massive investment. More races. More exposure. Everything was pointing up. Until now. And that creates a contradiction. How can a sport grow so much? And suddenly lose connection so quickly? The answer is uncomfortable. Because growth brings expectations. Higher standards. More attention. And when those expectations are not met, the drop feels even sharper. But this is where the situation becomes even more complex. Because not everyone wants the same solution. Some teams are pushing for immediate changes. They see the risk. They feel the instability. They want action. Now. Others are more cautious. Because they are competitive. Because they benefit from how things are. And in Formula One, success changes perspective. If you are winning, the system works. If you are losing, it needs to change. And that creates tension. Quiet. Political. Constant. Behind every discussion. Behind every proposal. Behind every delay. But right in the middle of all of this is the governing body. Trying to hold everything together. Safety. Performance. Fairness. Entertainment. And most importantly, time. Because time is running out. Every race without improvement adds pressure. Every drop in audience adds urgency. Every complaint from drivers adds visibility. And eventually, all of that reaches a point where it cannot be managed quietly anymore. But here is the key detail. The changes they are preparing, they are not bold. They are careful, measured, controlled. Because they have to be. They cannot break agreements. They cannot rewrite the entire system. They can only adjust it. And that means one thing. The core problem stays. And this is where the real question begins. Not whether Formula One can improve this, but whether it can improve it enough. Enough to bring back the feeling. Enough to restore confidence. Enough to stop the decline before it becomes irreversible. Because once a sport loses that connection with its audience, it is very difficult to rebuild. And Formula One knows that. That is why everything now leads to one critical point. The moment where all these changes, all these adjustments, all this pressure, will be tested. And what happens there will not just shape this season. It will shape what comes next. And this is where everything finally reaches its breaking point. Because all the tension, all the doubts, all the quiet reactions, they lead to one unavoidable reality. Formula One is no longer asking if there is a problem. It is asking how big that problem really is. And more importantly, whether it can still control it. Because up to now, everything has been contained. Drivers speak carefully. Teams choose their words. Officials stay silent. But beneath that surface, there is urgency. Real urgency. Emergency meetings. Constant discussions. Rapid proposals. Not planned development. Reaction. And when a sport like Formula One starts reacting instead of leading, that is when you know something has shifted. But here is the part that changes everything. Even if they fix the visible issues, even if the cars become more stable, even if the racing improves slightly, there is something much harder to repair. Trust. Because once drivers lose confidence in the car, they never fully commit the same way again. Once teams realize the system is unstable, they design around fear, not performance. And once fans feel disconnected, they do not come back just because things are slightly better. They come back when it feels right again. And right now, it does not. But this is where the story becomes even more complex. Because Formula One cannot admit this openly. It cannot say the system is flawed at its core. It cannot say the foundation needs rethinking. Because that would create something far bigger than a regulation problem. It would create doubt in the future of the sport. And Formula One is built on one idea above everything else. Confidence. Confidence in its technology. Confidence in its direction. Confidence that it always represents the absolute peak. So instead, it adjusts. Carefully. Quietly. Trying to move forward without breaking the narrative. But here is the risk. If you protect the narrative more than the reality, eventually, reality catches up. And when it does not give you time to react. It forces you to. And that is exactly what Miami represents. Not just another race, Not just another update, but a moment of truth. Because for the first time since these rules began, everything will be judged at once. The racing, the safety, the competitiveness, the feeling, and most importantly, the reaction. If the races suddenly feel alive again, if drivers push harder, if overtakes feel real, then maybe the story changes. Maybe this becomes a difficult start that eventually found its balance. But if nothing changes, if the same problems remain visible, if the same questions come back immediately, then something much bigger happens. The narrative breaks. And once that happens, you cannot control it anymore. Because fans will not wait. They will not analyze. They will decide. Quickly, quietly. And that decision is what defines the future of any sport. So now Formula One is standing at a very unusual point. Not at the peak of dominance. Not in a moment of celebration. But at a crossroads. Between innovation and identity. Between complexity and clarity. Between what it wants to be and what it actually is becoming. And the most important part is this. The answer is coming. Very soon. Not in a meeting. Not in a statement. But on track. Because when the lights go out, there is nowhere left to hide. And in that moment, everyone will see the same thing. Not what Formula One promised, but what it truly is. And the real question is, will that be enough? And if that answer is no, then everything changes. Because what we are watching right now is not just a difficult transition. It is a stress test of the rules, of the technology, of the leadership behind the sport, and most importantly, of the audience's patience. Because Formula One has always operated on a fragile balance. Innovation without losing identity. Complexity without losing clarity. Progress without losing the essence of racing. But this time, that balance feels closer to the edge than ever before. And here is the part that almost no one wants to confront. What if this is not just a bad version of the rules, but the wrong direction entirely? Because every fix we have talked about, every adjustment, every emergency change, they all assume the same thing, that the foundation is correct, and only the execution failed. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the idea of building Formula One around heavy energy management, around constant limitation, around systems that override instinct, what if that idea itself is the problem? Because if that is true, then no adjustment will fully solve it. You can reduce the symptoms. You can smooth the extremes. You can make it safer, more predictable, more controlled. But you cannot bring back what was lost. That raw, immediate connection. The feeling that anything can happen? Because the driver is always on the limit. And this is where the future of Formula One becomes uncertain. Not because the sport is disappearing, but because it might become something different. Something more calculated, more engineered, less instinctive, and for some, that is evolution. For others, that is loss. But here is where everything becomes even more critical. Because Formula One is not alone in the world anymore. There are more series, more options, more ways to experience racing. And if Formula One moves too far away from what made it unique, it risks blending into something else, something less distinctive. And once that happens, it is very difficult to reverse. But this is where the final layer reveals itself. Because beyond the fans, beyond the drivers, beyond the teams, there is one group that ultimately decides everything. The manufacturers. The ones investing billions. The ones building these power units. The ones shaping the future of the sport. And right now, they are watching closely. Because for them, this is not just about racing. It is about relevance, technology transfer, brand value. And if the product on track does not deliver, if the audience declines, if the narrative weakens, then their interest changes. Slowly, quietly, but significantly.